Welcome back to Investing Talk podcast. Today we're taking a look into Imunon, specifically their lead program for advanced ovarian cancer.
Right. It's a company that certainly generated a lot of discussion lately. New clinical data, some regulatory moves. It's definitely caused some stock movement and, well, chatter.
For sure. And to help make sense of it all, we've gathered quite a few sources for this deep dive. We've got the official company announcements, their recent financial reports.
And importantly, we've also looked at a pretty active online forum discussion. That gives us a feel for the, let's say, unfiltered investor sentiment out there.
Yeah, the raw takes. So our goal for you today is really to cut through that noise. We want to help you understand the core information from all these different angles.
Explore the various perspectives, the bullish and the bearish, and try to figure out what it might actually mean for the company's outlook.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is Imunon focused on?
Well, they're a clinical stage biotech company. That just means their potential treatments are still being tested in clinical trials with people. Their main area is DNA-based immunotherapies.
Right, and the one really getting attention now is IMNN-001. It's aimed squarely at advanced ovarian cancer, and it's a localized treatment.
That's the key part. It uses their TheraPlast technology. You can think of that as like a delivery vehicle for DNA instructions. It's given intraperitoneally, so directly into the abdominal cavity where the ovaries are.
Exactly.
And the whole idea is to get the body's own cells right there at the tumor site to start producing specific cancer-fighting molecules, things like interleukin-12.
So it's trying to activate the immune system locally, right where the cancer is growing.
Precisely, turning that tumor environment into an immune hotspot, hopefully.
Interesting approach. So what have the sources pointed to as evidence that this might actually be working?
The main thing, the real catalyst for a lot of the recent optimism, came from the Phase 2 Ovation 2 trial results. Those were announced back in December 2024.
And what did those Phase 2 results actually show? What were the headlines?
They reported an improvement in overall survival for patients with advanced ovarian cancer. This was when IMNN-001 was added to the standard chemotherapy regimen. The specific number mentioned was a median overall survival improvement of 11.1 months compared to chemo alone.
11.1 months. I mean, for advanced ovarian cancer, that sounds like a pretty notable difference.
It does, and the sources also highlighted some more detail. They mentioned the improvement was even greater, actually, over 15 months for the patients who got at least, I think it was 20% of the recommended doses.
Ah, okay. So that suggests a dose-response relationship.
Yeah, that translational data seems to support that idea, that the effect might be dose-dependent.
And it wasn't just the clinical results making noise. The sources also talked about positive FDA interactions late last year.
Yes, that's crucial. They had a positive CMC meeting, that's chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, in December, and they completed their end of Phase 2 meeting in November.
Which basically means?
Well, these meetings are really important signals. It suggests they're aligned with the FDA on things like how the drug is made, its quality, and crucially, the plan for the next big trial, the one needed for potential approval. It sort of clears the path forward, you could say.
Okay, so laying the groundwork for the next steps. And this data is getting some external validation too, isn't it?
It is. The Phase 2 results were accepted for an oral presentation at the big ASCO annual meeting coming up right at the end of May. And it's also set to be published in a key journal, Gynecologic Oncology, on June 3rd. Getting into ASCO and a peer-reviewed journal, that's definitely a stamp of approval from the scientific community.
Right. And there was also some data back in February supporting the mechanism, how it actually works.
That's right. They showed translational data confirming that those immune molecules, IL-12, interferon gamma, TNF-alpha, were indeed being produced locally at the tumor site. And very importantly, this was happening without reports of serious immune side effects systemically, throughout the rest of the body. That's a big plus from a safety perspective for this kind of therapy.
Okay, so you've got promising Phase 2 data, you've got positive FDA feedback, supporting mechanistic data. The next logical move for a company like this is a bigger trial, right? Phase 3.
Exactly, the confirmatory trial. And the sources confirm they've just taken that step. On May 8th, just recently, Imunon announced they initiated the first trial site for their Phase 3 study called Ovation 3.
Okay, Ovation 3. What do we know about the design of that study from the sources?
It's designed to compare IMNN-001 plus standard chemo directly against standard chemo alone, head-to-head. They're enrolling women with newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer, specifically stage 3C or 4, who are eligible for neoadjuvant therapy. That's treatment before surgery.
And the main goal they're measuring, the primary endpoint.
Overall survival. Same endpoint that showed promise in phase 2, which makes sense. The sources also mention they're specifically looking at a subgroup of patients who are HRD positive.
Okay, that's a genetic marker relevant for some targeted therapy.
Right. And those HRD positive patients in the trial will also receive PRP inhibitors, which is now a standard maintenance therapy for that group. So it seems like a well-designed trial reflecting current practice.
Moving to phase 3 is definitely a major milestone, often the last big clinical step before you can even think about asking for approval. But these trials are notoriously expensive.
Oh, absolutely. Huge undertakings.
Yeah.
Which brings us neatly to the company's financial situation. And this was a major point of discussion in the sources, especially that online forum.
Right. So looking at their first quarter 2025 results, the period ending March 31st, what do they report?
They reported a net loss of $4.1 million for the quarter. That's $0.28 per share.
How does that compare?
It was actually an improvement compared to the same quarter the year before, Q1 2024, when the loss was $4.9 million, or 0.52 cents per share.
Okay, so loss narrowed slightly. What drove that?
Operating expenses were down overall, mostly because spending wound down on the completed phase 2 ovarian trial and also a phase 1 vaccine trial they ran, though their G&A general and administrative costs did tick up a bit.
And the critical number, cash on hand,
As of March 31st, they had $2.9 million in cash and equivalents,
which was down from.
down from $5.87 million at the end of 2024. They used about $2.8 million in operating activities just in that first quarter.
So $2.9 million based on their burn rate. What did the company say about how long that would last?
At the time of that report, they stated they had enough cash to fund operations into the late second quarter of 2025.
Which is not very long. That implies a pretty short cash runway.
Exactly. And that's a common point of focus, even concern for companies at this stage. It means more funding is needed, and soon.
And lo and behold, they announced funding recently.
Yes. On May 23rd, they announced a private placement deal. It's structured to potentially bring in up to $9.75 million over time. They received $3.25 million of that upfront.
And the sources presented this as a move specifically to fund.
To fund the phase 3 trial launch and continuation, absolutely. And also just to keep their other pipeline activities going, it was framed as a necessary step to support that critical Ovation 3 study.
Makes sense. But while that funding helps the immediate pressure, the financial risks were definitely a theme in the online forum commentary, right? What were the big worries being voiced there?
Yeah, the forum talk really zeroed in on the fact that even with this placement, the cash runway needs ongoing watching. And crucially, the potential for more dilution down the line.
Dilution.
Yeah.
Issuing more shares. Always a sensitive topic for existing shareholders.
Very much so. And the discussion wasn't just acknowledging dilution might be needed for R&D. Some of the more skeptical voices, let's say, framed it quite negatively, suggesting it primarily benefits management, especially pointing to the stock's past performance.
Okay.
There was definitely frustration there about repeated share issuance.
Okay. Were there other financial red flags mentioned in the analysis?
Yes. The sources also pointed to a high debt-to-equity ratio, basically meaning they rely quite a bit on debt financing compared to equity, and also a current ratio below 1.
Which indicates.
That their short-term liabilities are actually greater than their short-term liquid assets. It's often seen as a potential liquidity risk indicator.
So, painting the picture. It's a company losing money on heavy R&D, needing outside cash, pretty typical for early biotech, as you said, but with some specific financial metrics that analysts and forum posters are watching closely.
That sums it up well. It's the classic biotech balancing act.
And how has the market actually reacted to the clinical news and this recent financing?
Well, the sources noted a pretty significant stock surge recently. An 8.6% jump just on May 27th was mentioned. And another source pointed back to a huge rally, something like 175%, after those positive phase 2 results first came out late last year.
So definite signs of investor optimism responding to the positive developments.
Seems so. Fueled by that clinical progress and maybe some relief from the immediate funding round.
What about analyst views? Did the sources mention those?
They did cite some analyst perspectives, though they seemed mostly from a bit earlier, around January 2025. The consensus was described then as buy or strong buy, with some pretty high price targets mentioned, an average over $13, one analyst apparently going as high as $30.
Wow. though those are obviously aspirational targets based on future success.
Absolutely. Highly dependent on everything going right from here.
And the potential market, if they do succeed, ovarian cancer treatment is a big area.
It really is. The market for ovarian cancer drugs was projected to hit around $6.8 billion by 2027. So yes, a substantial opportunity, but it's also a very crowded field, very competitive. The sources mention other companies like Agenus, Inovio, working in related immune-oncology spaces.
So Immunon's slice of that pie really hinges on IMNN-001 proving itself effective and potentially offering advantages over whatever else is out there or coming soon.
That's the crux of it. Success and differentiation are key.
Which brings us back to that contrasting sentiment, particularly from the online forum. What were some of the more skeptical counterarguments presented there?
Well, alongside the optimism, there is definitely strong caution. People pointing out that any talk of imminent approval is way off base. Phase 3 just started. It'll take time.
Some of the language got pretty strong, didn't it?
It did. We saw terms like scam corporation or PND, that's pump and dump, being thrown around in some posts, basically expressing a belief that the company's main focus might be more on stock promotion and raising money that benefits insiders rather than purely on the science.
And were they questioning the therapy itself, too?
Yes, there was skepticism voiced about whether IMNN-001 is truly going to be better than other options, even with the Phase 2 data, sort of a wait-and-see for Phase 3 attitude or even outright doubt.
So it's important to hear those views, too. They reflect the inherent risks and the strong opinions that swirl around these kinds of stocks.
Definitely. It paints the full spectrum of perspectives found in the sources.
So if you try to synthesize all of this, the clinical promise, the financial realities, the market reaction, the skepticism, how did the analysis sources generally characterize the investment outlook for Imunon?
Overwhelmingly as speculative, which is, again, par for the course for a clinical stage biotech. Success isn't guaranteed, trials can fail, the regulatory path is tough, funding is always a need, high risk, high potential reward scenario.
But potential opportunity still exists.
Yes, the opportunity lies in the innovative science and that promising, albeit early, data for IMNN-001. So the suggestion we saw cited was maybe a hold or a speculative buy, but only for investors who really understand and can tolerate the risks involved, and who are prepared to watch clinical and financial developments very closely.
Okay, before we summarize, the sources did briefly mention some other things Imunon is working on, just for context.
Right. They have another platform technology called Plaxine. It's for DNA vaccines. Under that umbrella, they actually completed a Phase 1 trial for a COVID-19 booster vaccine candidate called IMNN-101.
How did that go?
The data was described positively. Safe, well-tolerated, it induced antibody responses, showed some cross-reactivity. Preclinical work apparently showed promise similar to mRNA vaccines. The plan mentioned was to look for partners to take that forward.
So other irons in the fire.
Right.
But it seems clear the main focus, the main value driver right now is the ovarian cancer program.
Absolutely. That's where the immediate story is.
Okay, let's try and pull the main threads together from this deep dive for you, the listener. Imunon has put out some genuinely promising Phase 2 results for its lead ovarian cancer therapy, IMNN-0001.
And that positive data, along with getting constructive feedback from the FDA, has allowed them to start their big, potentially pivotal Phase 3 trial. That's a huge step.
They've also just secured some much-needed funding through a private placement. Critical cash to help pay for that very expensive Phase 3 study and keep the lights on.
And all of this positive momentum, the clinical progress, the funding has clearly sparked significant positive reaction in the market, judging by the stock moves and some of the analyst views cited.
But, and it's a big but, the sources also highlight the significant hurdles, the typical biotech challenges.
Right. There's the cash situation. Even with the new funds, the runway needs watching. More capital will likely be needed down the road. Which brings up the specter of future dilution, something certain investors, according to the forums, view very skeptically. And some financial ratios flag potential short-term risks.
Plus, they're playing in a super competitive field, cancer therapy, and getting a drug through trials and approved by regulators is always a long, uncertain, and expensive process.
So what this whole case study really shows you, as someone trying to understand these companies, is that classic biotech tension. On one side, you have the exciting potential for a real medical advance, addressing a tough disease like advanced ovarian cancer.
And on the other side, you have the cold, hard financial realities, the massive clinical and regulatory risks, and this whole ecosystem of differing investor opinions trying to weigh it all up. Seeing all those facets is key.
It really is a complex puzzle.
So maybe here's something provocative for you to think about after this. Given the potential impact Imunon's drug could have based on that promising early data, how much weight should you give that biological promise compared to the company's current financial pressures and that long, uncertain road still ahead through phase 3 and regulatory review?
That's the core question in biotech investing, isn't it? Balancing hope and risk.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources surrounding Imunon. We hope breaking it down like this has been useful.
Yeah, let us know what you think. What stands out most to you from all this? Any key takeaways? Or maybe suggest what company or topic you'd like us to explore next time.
And please remember to subscribe, like this discussion if you found it valuable, and leave us a comment with your thoughts.